You're about to watch two programmes from the BBC's world-famous Natural History Unit, Bird Brain of Britain and The Flying Gourmet's Guide, just one of the wildlife specials priced at £9.99 each. BBC Wildlife Specials also contain some touching true life stories, including Squirrel on My Shoulder.
I tried giving the young squirrel a start in the right direction, staying close at hand, ready to jump to the rescue if the cat decided to turn on the uninvited guest.
On the same cassette, the highly acclaimed Brockside, a true-life soap opera starring families of badgers that live in and around towns and have adapted to an urban way of life. Also in the series of wildlife specials, On the Tracks of the Wild Otter, a film about the lives of these very rare and beautiful animals in their home on the Shetland Islands, captured for BBC Video by top cameraman Hugh Miles. And on the same £9.99 video, The Mouse's Tale, the story of the little rodents that share our homes and our lives. Aliens from inner space, animals that could come from another world, but quietly inhabit our own in the depths of the oceans, now captured on BBC Video in all their strange and colourful beauty. And on the same cassette, just when you thought it was safe to go back into the water, the fastest claw in the West tells the story of the killer shrimps.
Many strange creatures haunt the depths of the sea, but few have such an unexpected talent as the mantis shrimp.
Southampton, 1921. A new type of raid takes place. Method of entry, break-in through milk bottle top. Object, theft of cream inside. Culprit, a blue tit. Once learnt, this new technique proves popular and is swiftly copied by other criminals. Nowadays, the crime wave has spread all over the country.
A lot of you have probably had this happen to your milk, and even though you may have been a little bit annoyed that they'd stolen the cream, you were probably impressed that a bird was clever enough to learn such a trick. Well, that's precisely what this programme is all about. It's a nationwide search to find the clever birds in the country, and if you reckon breaking into a bottle is smart, just have a look at this.
How do you get at a wagon load of peanuts that weighs 3 or 4 times more than you do? In the 50s, an amateur naturalist called H.G. Hurrell, together with Maurice Brooks King, posed this problem for the birds visiting his garden. Only one blue tit, dubbed Shorty because he'd lost his tail, ever worked it out. 30 years later, The winter before last, in fact, another of Hurrell's designs was retested in more than 20 gardens around the south of England. A peanut is hidden in the drawer of the matchbox. Tap down the drawer from the top and the nut drops out. My role in the search was to film the birds as they tackled the problems. After a few weeks, this blue tit was beginning to solve the matchbox test, and before long, both blue and great tits were cracking it regularly. When that matchbox test was shown on television last year, it fascinated a lot of people, just as it had fascinated Hurrell and Brooks King. In fact, it started a nationwide search for the bird brain of Britain. One new test gave us an insight into how the birds were learning to solve these problems. A toothbrush holder with 4 matchsticks. Pull out the matches and the nut drops out. This blue tit still hasn't worked out that pulling matches and the nut dropping are related. He's encouraged by the sight of his reward and eventually, perhaps through frustration rather than reason, pulls out a matchstick. An aggressive great tit seems to have worked out the method. But apparently he's still unsure of the order. After about 1 week, the blue tit seems to catch on, even if he is a little bit hesitant. Success at last. Well, nearly. The test is reset, and the great tit demonstrates what can eventually be learnt by trial and error. The next test I filmed couldn't be learnt in stages. It consisted of peanuts on strings suspended between sheets of perspex. The only way to get at the nuts is to pull up the strings. Many birds were attracted by the sight of the nuts, but they were at a loss as to how to get to them. Finally, one male great tit appeared and did the test straight off. This one seemed to be a natural when it came to string pulling, and so a plan was hatched to see just how long a string this bird could handle. 30 centimetres, and he has no problem at all. Apart from the crows and a few finches, the tits are the only British birds that have been seen string pulling in the wild. In slow motion, you can really appreciate the delicate coordination of beak and footwork it requires. Just when I was beginning to think that tits were the only potential bird brain winners, I heard that a chaffinch was attempting this extraordinary homemade nail test. But this hen bird hadn't learned that you had to pull out the nails in the right order to get a reward. Finches were often seen hanging around the tests, probably hoping to pick up scraps, but it was always the tits that worked out the technique. The chaffinch did eventually learn to take advantage of work done by others. Another test-cracking species was reported from Bath, but this one wasn't the intended student. By March of the first year, however, it was clear that the tits were emerging nationwide as the champions. Within weeks, they seemed able to crack any single stage problem they were faced with. To stretch them further, a two-stage test was developed. This time, the contestants not only have to pull out the matches, but also tap down the matchbox tray. The blue tit was obviously an old hand at the matches, but was stumped by the matchbox. With most of the work done for him, a nearby great tit finishes the job, leaving one rather annoyed blue tit. This unusual relationship went on for at least a week. The great tit knew the box test, the blue tit knew the toothbrush holder. This time, the blue tit gets its reward. In a roundabout sort of fashion. To me, it appeared almost as though one bird was struggling to understand what the other was doing. He throws a match in pure frustration. Finally, and without the help of its unlikely ally, the great tit succeeds. By the end of the first year, it was beginning to look as though the tits were the only birds that were going to try the puzzles. In fact, very few other birds even visited the tests. Now, this brings up the question, is it because the tits are more intelligent? Well, it's difficult to say, but it's probably just that the birds, the tits that is, feeding habits, are best suited to the matchbox type of puzzle. In fact, if you watch a woodland like this, you can see the very same feeding behaviour on the beech mast as they use on the matchbox puzzle. Great tits and blue tits are used to searching for food hidden in crevices or leaf litter. They have an inquisitive, searching nature that encourages them to attempt the tests in the first place. Ripping open milk bottle tops may just be a natural extension of the ripping behaviour they use every day to break into the food they find. So the tits clearly had an unfair advantage from day one. So what we needed then was to devise a test that didn't require the agility that the tits had, which might then attract some more species of birds. Different designs were tried throughout the country. In Scotland, a large version of the toothbrush holder was built for members of the crow family. Meat replaced peanuts, and there were bigger pegs for bigger beaks. Even though it was an excellent area for rooks, they were rarely seen around the test, and then only when there was food that could be quickly grabbed. The crows, which come in for a hard time from man, were just too wary, or maybe too bright, to drop their guard. On the Cumbrian coast at Walney, an electric test was tried out on herring gulls. It consisted of plastic cups that were filled up with dog meat. If the gulls pressed the button, the cups would revolve and reveal some meat. The first gulls were attracted by scraps left on top. The researchers hoped gulls would learn to press the button by mistake, which they duly did. Before long, the device was in regular use, but the gulls never managed to solve a more complex problem than button pushing. Pigeons were tested with another electric device. Peck the red button and grain is delivered from a clearly visible store. Within 2 weeks, a couple of pigeons had solved the problem. But this relatively simple task was just the first stage. The plan was to gradually make the electric box more difficult and compare how the pigeons fared against the tits.
Meanwhile, the search for the bird brain of Britain was going on, and some interesting things are beginning to emerge.
In Maidstone, Catherine Jones was determined to discover whether the birds coming to her garden could recognise and remember colours. She designed a colour-coded feeder. The nuts were hidden behind the white front, but the birds could only get food by pulling the red matches. The first arrivals pulled randomly at both colours until eventually they got a nut. But after 2 months, this blue tit knew what he was doing. Just watch how persistently he pulls at the red matches, totally ignoring the blue ones. Determination pays off in the end. Meanwhile, in a Sussex garden, Andrew and Stuart Hyland designed yet another colour test out of Lego. The nut is delivered by the blue lever. By changing the position of the blue tab, they were able to conclusively test that the birds responded to the colour and not just the position of the tab. And once more.
Well, we've seen the blue tits doing the colour test, but what about shapes? Well, here in Kent, Jeff Bennett had a great spotted woodpecker visiting his garden. So he decided to test the birds by putting out these different shaped plaques on his lawn and loading just the star-shaped ones with cob nuts, like this.
At first, this male woodpecker checked all the shapes for food. But after about 6 weeks, he learned to ignore the other shapes and only visited the stars.
By the time that woodpecker had sorted out the problem with the shapes, the pigeons here on the roofs of Bristol were beginning to get to grips with a more complex version of the electric box test.
Of the 2 discs, only one ever delivers grain. At the moment, green is sensitive. The box is switched to red by remote control, and at first this bright pigeon persists with green, but eventually tries red. It's switched back, and the pigeon also reverts to green. Only 2 pigeons ever learnt to change over like this. Psychologists call this the ability to reverse, and it's often used as a simple test of animal intelligence. We wondered how the tits would manage a similar choice. They had learnt to jump on either the red or the green bar. At the moment, red gives a reward. When the changeover is made, however, the first arrival is understandably confused. And eventually gives up without trying the green bar. In fact, the tits never learnt to make rapid reversals, and it was usually a good 20 minutes before they were back on the correct colour. At the start of 1985, we got our first heavy snowfalls. Natural food supplies became scarce. Hunger sharpened appetite and increased activity at bird tables. And I started to hear of new puzzles being solved all round the country. In Somerset, Dennis Edwards was so determined to discover which individual birds visiting his garden were the smartest that he put coloured rings on their legs and challenged them with this block pull test. To solve the test, the birds have to pull the string, which is connected to the block, that then delivers the nut through the hole in the front of the tube. This bird without a ring clearly hasn't got a clue. The bird with the pink ring again does it perfectly. Dennis Edwards then decided to challenge them with the most complex test for tits so far. It's a multi-block test. This time, the birds not only have to pull the string, but the clever bird has to look at the position of the nut before he does so. It's only that way that he'll pull the blocks in the right order. The bird without a ring again, getting it wrong. When he comes back, though, he takes the time to look at the position of the nut. And gets it right, with great efficiency. The joy of colouring the garden regulars was that their individual characters began to emerge. This blue tit with a white ring on its leg was a very nervous bird, but also very bright. The bird with a red ring on its leg often turned up and was more dominant, but didn't seem to be quite as clever. He pulls at the blocks without looking at the position of the nut. Finally, he does it in the right order. The cold weather also encouraged pigeons to solve this high-tech task. They have to peck the 4 buttons in the right order: red, orange, green, then white. And the robot arm will fetch them some grain. This dark little bird learned to press the red button first, and the arm duly scooped up some grain. But there, things ground to a halt. It wasn't until March, when the snow had gone, that this same pigeon finally cottoned on. First, it presses the red button correctly. The interesting thing about this test is the bird now has to wait. It can't press the next button until the arm has stopped moving. Notice how the bird seems to be watching the position of the arm until it stops. There goes the orange tab. Arm stops. Now the green. And the white. Just when I thought that the pigeons had really proved themselves undeniably smarter than the tits, we heard from Sussex that even though there was food freely available on the bird table, some blue tits were starting to solve a Lego test that involved not only 3 stages, but also required 3 totally different techniques. They have to spin the arm, take out the match and then tip the seesaw to get the nut. There goes the nut, down to the second chamber. The first birds to see the test had trouble at this second stage. The test is reset, and a bird completes it, although not in the correct order. He takes out the match first, spins the arms, tips the seesaw, and pays for his mistake by losing the nut to a great tit. And this time in the correct order. Spin the arm, take out the match, and get your nut. One more time. 3 stages in the correct order. Back with the pigeons on the roofs of Bristol, one bird surprised us with a new level of intelligence. The electric box now had a light. White meant peck red, yellow meant peck green. Even the most complex multi-stage test might eventually be solved by trial and error, but this was different. The pigeon here had to think out the relationship between the lights and the buttons to get the grain. Had this pigeon beaten the tits to the title of Bird Brain of Britain? I took academic advice. The Oxford University zoologist, Dr. John Krebs, has been setting his own intelligence tests for tits. How did he rate their performance?
Well, I think all the tests we've seen so far in the search for the Bird Brain of Britain look very impressive, but when you think about what the birds are actually doing, it's rather like this simple children's game. The tits have the dexterity to fit the shapes into the holes, like this, and they're able to discriminate between different shapes so they can put the right shape in the right hole. That's all very well, but it's quite a different matter to play a game like chess. To play a game like chess, you need not only the dexterity to move the pieces around on the board, but you also have to be able to think, to plan ahead.
Krebs believes that recent studies have shown many birds plan ahead just for day-to-day survival. In one study, special bird tables for wild starlings were set up, near to the nest box. And also in a field much further away. In the spring, when starlings are working hard to keep their chicks fed, they have to make a decision where they're going to collect food before they leave the nest box. When they go a short distance, to the nearby bird table, the researchers found they would only take a couple of mealworms before returning to their hungry chicks. When starlings make the longer flights over the fields to the distant feeding station, just as we might decide to drive out to the hypermarket, they make sure they get a good beakful. Similarly, we make sure we get a good trolley load for the extra effort involved. The worms get fewer and harder to find, and more of the bird's time goes in loading up and checking out. So like us, the starlings have to decide whether to make a few long-distance trips for a lot of food or more short trips for less. But for the bird, calculating where to go and how many worms to bring back is vital. If they're wrong, chicks may starve to death.
The remarkable thing is that the birds seem to get it more or less right every flight. They bring back the maximum amount of food for healthy growth of their chicks. Now, this must involve complex decisions, although we don't really know how they do it.
Perhaps then, our garden birds may be a lot more intelligent than we originally thought they were. I certainly got that impression when I filmed the Bird Brain of Britain doing this quite remarkable multi-stage test.
Believe it or not, 8 stages had to be solved, and all in the right order. When I was called in to film the performance, it had taken this same white-ringed bird over a year of gradual learning to crack this ultimate test. First, take out the matchsticks. Then, tip the seesaw. Pull the nails in the correct order. And then a block pull test. Let's hear it for the Bird Brain of Britain.